Hi, I've got my indoor clothes on, coming to you from my library because I bought 5 box making books. I read them all. I will tell you which one is my favorite and which one is a complete failure. I bought the books because I want to become better at box making. I guess that's sort of obvious. I'm not a professional woodworker. I don't aspire to be one, but I want to have projects that are impressive. And I think a good way to achieve those skills would be to get good at box making. If a box is going to be impressive, somebody has to be able to pick it up, get close to it, and still not have it be flawed. I think if I can achieve that on boxes, that'll convert to other bigger woodworking projects. I didn't realize it when I was ordering the books, but the 5 books are only by 2 authors. 3 of them are by Doug Stowe, 2 of them are by Matt Kenny. I'm sure Stowe and Kenny know a lot more about box making than I'll ever learn, and they're probably always going to be better box makers than I am. The question though, for me, and where I feel like I can validly criticize their books, is whether they've communicated that skill and knowledge in a way that's useful for an intermediate woodworker or maybe even a beginner woodworker. My least favorite of the 5 books is the 2004 book from Doug Stowe, Tauntons, Complete Illustrated Guide to Box Making by Doug Stowe. It's a survey of techniques. It doesn't focus on, an individual project by project approach. The problem I have with it is there's a lot of techniques in it, but not much detail in each technique. I'll give just one example, and that is pattern veneering. So the idea is that you would get a bunch of different colored veneers, make a nice pattern so that the different colors of veneers would fit together in a beautiful pattern, without gaps in between the pieces. I don't think the instructions that they give, there's only 1 page on pattern veneering. It consists of, 2 paragraphs and 5 photos. I don't think it's nearly enough for somebody to be able to successfully do a pattern veneering project. I don't think it comes close. For example, the author says, check carefully to make sure that there's no gaps between the parts before gluing. Well, there are going to be gaps with the way they talk about making the parts in this book. They say, print out your design on a piece of paper, glue that down to a piece of fiberboard or plywood, use a scroll saw to cut out the various pieces, and then use those pieces of MDF or plywood or whatever as a pattern to cut out your veneers. Well, if you do that, there is guaranteed to be a gap between all those pieces because you've got the saw blade curve unaccounted for. That's not mentioned in here. I'm sure there's a way to deal with that. People use that technique for scroll sawing. I just don't know how they deal with the saw blade curve. It's not mentioned in the book, and I just don't think anybody could pick up the book and expect to have success with that technique. Sadly, most, if not all, of the other techniques in the book are the same way. There's just not enough detail on any of them to feel like somebody could have success doing them. So I have to write this book off as being, frankly, a complete fail. The next book is a big step up in quality. It's 52 Boxes in 52 Weeks by Matt Kenny. It's not primarily a technique book. It is primarily a design book. Out of the 120 pages in the book, only 20 are about technique, but there are 20 pretty good pages about technique. I think you can really learn a lot by them and have success applying to those techniques. There's one in particular I'm going to talk about called a grain wrap, and that's a technique where you take a box and make the grain so that it matches at all 4 corners of the box. So grain wrap, and I'm going to talk about that because I think it's kind of a really good intermediate box making technique that I'd like to master. And on an appropriate box, if you're making a box with mitered corners, that's something that you really ought to consider and probably do every time you're making a box with mitered corners. Well, Kenny's got a really good section in this book, like 6 or 8 of his 20 pages are about how to do that grain wrap technique. That's going to come up in some of the other books I talk about that don't deal with it as well as Kenny deals with it. The other 100 pages of the book are about design, and Matt Kenny's design philosophy is super simple. I think he says in the book that he doesn't like adornment. Boxes don't need adornment, and he tries to make everything as super simple as he can. I'm obviously not quoting him directly there. But I think that's a fair way to look at his design philosophy, where everything is just pared down to simplicity. Well, one of the reasons I'm standing here is simplicity is great, but it depends on the context. This is my wife's parade saddle. If I were to put one of those super simple Matt Kenny boxes in any room with this incredibly ornate, silver parade saddle, you're just not going to see the box. It's going to disappear. It's just not going to be noticeable. So I kind of like adornment. Matt Kenny obviously doesn't like adornment. I still think it's a valid book because he's very thoughtful about his design process. And I think that would translate even if you have different design tastes than Matt Kenny does. So it's a worthwhile book. Next, I've got two more books by Doug Stowe that I'll talk about together because they're pretty similar. I do have a favorite among the two. The two books are Basic Box Making. I believe that one is from 2007. And Beautiful Boxes, I believe that one's from 2014. Both of these Doug Stowe books I think are much better than the other Doug Stowe book that I sort of trashed early on in the review. The techniques in these books are presented in the context of specific projects. For example, he'll show you how to build this little box that's on the cover, and in doing that, he'll show you the techniques that are needed to build that little box. The instructions for each of these projects I think are sufficient that you could use the techniques and successfully build the projects. So that's, in contrast to the first Doug Stowe book I talked about, where I didn't think there was enough detail in any of those techniques. These are different and they're a lot better. One thing I do like about both of these books is they also have some very helpful jigs. One of them, for example, is a spline jig. I think he calls it a key miter jig or something like that, but I call it a spline jig. He's got one in the book. I like it. I made it. It works really well. It's super simple. Both of these books kind of fall short in that grain wrap technique that I talked about. For example, the second box in Beautiful Boxes, I think it's actually this one on the cover. It's this nice mitered box, and it would look just perfect to have one where there'd be a grain wrap around it. In discussing that project, that looks to me like it would be perfect for a grain wrap, here's what Stowe has to say. The craftsman may choose to match the lines of grain at the corners of a box of a way of expressing care, inviting the viewer to engage with the lines found in the wood. Well, it's practically poetic, and that's exactly what I want to do. Yes, show me how to make the lines of grain match at the corners in the box. Nope, doesn't do it. It's not at all in the book. He talks about that and waxes poetic about it, but doesn't actually show you how to do it. That's a pretty big failure in a book that otherwise has a lot of nice, useful projects and information. Basic Box Making, I think, is a little bit better, but it's kind of strange in the way it deals with the grain wrap too. Like, for example, the box on the cover could have used a nice grain wrap. That's a mitered box, and he's got other mitered boxes in there. But instead of showing the grain wrap technique with a mitered box, he shows the grain wrap technique with a box that has lap corners. And when you look at the lap corners, you can't see the grain wrap because what you're looking at is end grain all around the box. And so it doesn't really make sense to bother with a grain wrap technique if you're not going to show off the grain wrap with mitered corners. So it's a little bit odd, but at least the technique is in there. And I like both of these books. I like this one a little bit better than the Beautiful Boxes book. Build Better Boxes by Matt Kenny, the guy who likes the unadorned boxes. I think it's the best book in terms of the technique. For example, I've talked a lot about the grain wrap. He's got, I think, the best section on how to do the grain wrap, and he does the grain wrap on an appropriate box, one that's mitered and makes sense to have a grain wrap on. For his some other projects where it's not appropriate to have a grain wrap, for example, he's got a finger jointed box. Well, grain wrap makes no sense for that because, again, you're looking at end grain. He doesn't bother using a grain wrap on it. The other thing I like about the Matt Kenny book is, he believes in his unadorned designs, and maybe I don't agree with him on all of that stuff, but I think he's very thoughtful in terms of what would make a good design and how one should go about his designs. In the section of the book that talks about the use of grain, if you go down to the lumber yard, I often find boards with straight grain that doesn't run parallel to the edge cut by the sawyer. And so, you know, maybe it's a pretty obvious point, but he'll just go and recut those boards to make the grain parallel to the edge that he wants. He's not being limited by what the sawyer did. I think that's really useful, you know, when you just sit down and say, I'm going to make this project. Well, exactly what part of the board do I want to use to make that project looks best? And maybe that's a part with really heavy, crazy grain. Maybe it's a part with really fine parallel grain. It depends on your project. I think the point that's useful is that's something to be thought about. It's a good practice. It's a good discipline to think about, you know, whatever you're trying to achieve with on the design. So I like this book. It's my favorite of them. I do think there's two of them that are worthwhile. I think Build Better Boxes and Basic Box Making are worthwhile. If I only had to pick one, I'd get this one, the Build Better Boxes, the Matt Kinney book. If your wallet allows, it's nice to have this one too, because it does have a wider range of design choices on there, and that's sort of nice to see. So anyways, hope you enjoyed this. Please like the video if you liked it, and I welcome you to subscribe to my channel. Thanks very much. Bye.